I discovered your channel 3 weeks ago when I couldn't sleep. It was 2 in the morning, and I was scrolling through videos about anything that might quiet the noise in my head. Then I saw a thumbnail. A woman's face, half in shadow, with eyes that looked like they'd seen too much. The title said something about finding God in impossible places. I almost scrolled past it, but something made me click. Maybe it was the way she held her head, like she was carrying a secret too heavy for one person. Maybe it was recognition. The look of someone who'd walked through hell and somehow found heaven on the other side. I watched that video 3 times that night. Then I watched 17 more. Each one cut deeper. Each one showing me I wasn't the only one who'd lost everything and discovered that losing everything was just the beginning of finding what really mattered. Your channel became my lifeline. Every night for 3 weeks, I'd sit in my kitchen in Cyprus, drinking tea that tastes nothing like home, watching stories that sound exactly like mine. Women who'd paid prices they never planned to pay. Women who'd met Jesus in prisons and flames and places where hope goes to die. So here I am, finally ready to speak. My hands are shaking as I record this, but I can't stay silent anymore. Not after what I've seen, not after where I've been. You don't know me, but my name is Sarah. And this is the story of how I died and came back to life. How I lost my faith and found something stronger. How I walked through fire and discovered that sometimes God speaks loudest when the world burns down around you. I'm sitting in a concrete cell, and my face is on fire. Not metaphorically, literally. The skin pulls tight every time I try to speak, and every breath tastes like smoke and betrayal. In my hands, I'm holding what's left of my grandmother's Bible. The pages are curled and brown, some completely gone, others so charred you can barely make out the words that once brought me comfort. Through the metal bars, orange light flickers from somewhere I can't see. It's the only light I've had in days, maybe weeks. Time moves differently when you're buried alive. My lips are moving, but no sound comes out. I'm trying to remember Psalm 23, the one that carried me through childhood nightmares and adult fears. But the words keep slipping away like everything else I thought I could hold on to. I lift my eyes to that flickering orange light, and I whisper the only truth I have left. I saw him in the fire, and nobody believed me. But you will believe me, because you know what it's like to lose everything sacred and discover that sacred was never about what you could lose. You know what it means to have your faith burned away until all that's left is Him. This is my story, and if you're watching this at 2 in the morning because you can't sleep, because the world feels too dark and God feels too silent, then maybe it's your story too. Let me start where it really began. Not in that cell, not with the burns, but in a small classroom in a forgotten corner of the world where speaking His name could cost you your life, your family, your future. I was nobody special, just Sarah, an English teacher in a place where women weren't supposed to dream too loudly or reach too high. By day, I taught grammar and vocabulary to teenage boys who barely looked at me, who saw me as just another voice telling them about past participles and subjunctive moods. The classroom smelled like chalk dust and boredom, and most days I felt invisible. But in the evenings, when the sun disappeared behind the mountains and the call to prayer echoed across the rooftops, my real work began. My secret work. My dangerous work. 7 women would slip into my apartment, one by one, like shadows afraid of their own substance. They'd knock twice, pause, then knock once more. Our signal that it was safe. We'd sit in a circle on my grandmother's carpet, the one she'd woven by hand 50 years ago, with threads of gold and crimson that caught the lamplight like tiny flames. And I'd teach them English, real English, not just words, but windows, not just grammar, but freedom. I'd read them passages from the Bible in English, and we'd translate them together, sentence by sentence, breath by breath, prayer by prayer. "The truth will set you free," I'd whisper, and they'd repeat it back to me like a sacred incantation. Their voices would shake at first, afraid to speak those words aloud, even in the safety of my living room. Miriam was the youngest, maybe 19, with eyes that sparkled when she laughed and hands that moved like birds when she got excited about a new concept. She was quick with languages, hungry for every word, every phrase, every possibility that English represented. She'd stay after the others left, helping me put away the books, asking questions about America, about churches with stained glass windows, about hymns sung by hundreds of voices at once. "Miss Sarah," she'd say, her voice full of wonder, "do you really believe God hears us in English? Even here? Even when it's forbidden?" "I believe God hears us in every language," I'd tell her, touching her face gently. "Even in silence, even in fear, even in doubt." She'd smile then, and for a moment the fear would leave her eyes completely. One Thursday evening, Miriam didn't come. The other women exchanged worried glances as we waited, but we continued. Her empty space in our circle felt like a missing tooth, noticeable and wrong. Friday, still no Miriam. Saturday came and went with no word. By Sunday, her sister came to my door, eyes red and swollen from crying, her hands shaking as she gripped my doorframe. "They took her for questioning," she whispered, looking over her shoulder as if the walls had ears. About the classes, about other things. Things she might have said, things she might have done. My stomach turned to ice, but I kept my voice steady. When? Tuesday night. They came to our house after midnight. 3 men in dark clothes. They were polite, but... She shuddered. Politeness can be more terrifying than anger sometimes. That Sunday evening, I opened my door again, despite the fear crawling up my spine like spiders. 6 women arrived instead of 7. We sat in our circle, and Miriam's empty place seemed to grow larger, more accusatory. But we continued. We had to continue. I read from John. "In this world you will have trouble, but take heart. I have overcome the world." The words felt like armor and prophecy at the same time. Mrs. Farah, the oldest among us, reached over and squeezed my hand. "We know the risks," she said quietly. "We've always known. But knowing and experiencing are 2 different countries, and I was about to learn the difference. I thought God would protect us. I thought faith was a shield, prayer was armor, and righteousness was a fortress that could never be breached. I thought that if we were doing His work, serving His purpose, loving His people, then somehow we'd be invisible to those who wanted to destroy us. I was so beautifully, dangerously naive. The knock came on a Tuesday evening, exactly 1 week after they'd taken Miriam. Not the gentle tap of my students, but the heavy fist of men who don't wait for permission and don't ask twice. I was preparing for our lesson, arranging the Bibles on the coffee table, when the sound echoed through my apartment like thunder. My hands froze on the books. Every cell in my body knew what that knock meant. I opened the door, and there they were, 3 men in dark clothes, with eyes that had seen too much and decided to stop caring. Their faces were professional masks of indifference, but I could sense the violence sleeping just beneath the surface. "Sarah Hosseini," one of them said. It wasn't a question. It was a verdict. Behind them, barely visible in the hallway shadows, I saw her. Miriam. My beautiful, bright Miriam. But her face was different. Hollow. Defeated. She looked like someone had reached inside her and stolen her light. She wouldn't look at me directly, but I saw her lips moving in the dim light. "I'm sorry," she was mouthing. "I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry." They didn't let me get my coat. They didn't let me tell my mother goodbye. She was in the kitchen making tea, humming an old song my father used to sing when I was small, when the world still made sense and safety wasn't a luxury. I heard the kettle whistling as they led me away, a sound that would haunt my dreams for years to come. In the car, one of them held up my Bible, the one with my grandmother's notes in the margins, written in her careful handwriting during 40 years of secret faith. The one I'd carried for 15 years. Through university, through my first teaching job, through every crisis and celebration. "You've been busy," he said, flipping through the pages like he was examining evidence, which I suppose he was. The interrogation room smelled like cigarettes and fear and the sweat of 1,000 other people who'd sat in that same metal chair. They sat me down in the center of the room, and the chair was bolted to the floor so I couldn't move it even an inch. For 6 hours, they asked me the same questions over and over, like a prayer said in reverse. "Who sent you?" "No one sent me." "Who pays you to corrupt our women?" "I teach English, that's all." "Why do you poison young minds with foreign religion?" "I teach them to read. Reading isn't poison." "Where did you get these books?" "They're mine. They've always been mine." The man across from me had soft hands and gold teeth. He smiled when he spoke, like we were discussing the weather or sharing tea in a garden. His voice was gentle, almost fatherly, which made everything he said more terrifying. "Miss Sarah," he said, leaning forward like he was sharing a secret, "we can make this very simple for you, very clean. Sign this paper. Say you were confused. Say you won't teach these classes anymore. Go home to your mother. Forget this happened. Live your life." The paper was already prepared, typed and official, with spaces for my signature and the date. They'd been planning this for weeks, maybe months. Every word was chosen carefully to make me disappear without actually destroying me. I looked at it for a long time. My signature could end everything. I could be home by morning, back to teaching boys grammar, back to being invisible and safe and small. "I can't," I said. His smile disappeared like a light being switched off. That's when they moved me to the basement. The new room had no windows and no sense of time, just a bulb that flickered on and off at random intervals, and walls that wept moisture constantly like they were crying for all of us who'd been buried here. The air was thick and stale, recycled through too many lungs, carrying the ghosts of every prayer and scream and whispered confession that had ever echoed in this place. They brought in different men now. Holy men, they called themselves. Learned men with soft voices and patient explanations who spoke like they were trying to heal me of a terrible disease. Christianity is a Western infection, the eldest one explained, settling into his chair like a doctor preparing for a long consultation. It was forced upon your ancestors by colonizers who wanted to steal your soul along with your resources. You are suffering from cultural poisoning, but it can be cured. He had a kind face and spoke like a grandfather teaching a slow child. For hours, he'd show me books, charts, historical documents, maps of missionary movements, photographs of churches built on conquered lands, testimonies of people who'd been deceived and then recovered. Deep down, you know this, he'd say, his voice hypnotic and sure. Your heart knows the truth. You just need to remember who you really are. You need to come home to yourself. Some days, when the hunger was sharp and the thirst was sharper, when the walls closed in so tight I could barely breathe, I almost believed him. When you're tired enough, when you're broken enough, when the loneliness becomes a living thing that feeds on your hope, even lies start to sound like salvation. But then I'd remember Miriam's eyes when she first read John 3:16 in English, the way they'd filled with tears, not of sadness, but of recognition, like she was remembering something she'd always known, but never been allowed to say. I'd remember Mrs. Farah crying when she finally understood that God loved her personally, specifically by name, not as part of a crowd, but as herself. I'd remember my grandmother whispering prayers over my fever when I was 7 years old, her hands cool on my forehead, her voice certain that someone was listening. So, I stayed quiet, and they decided quiet wasn't enough. They moved me again, to a place where the guards had tired eyes and rough hands, where kindness was extinct and patience was a luxury no one could afford, where the food came once a day and tasted like cardboard, and the water came from pipes that had seen too much rust and neglect. Sleep became a weapon they used against me. They'd wake me every hour, then every 30 minutes, then just when I'd begun to dream. Questions at 3 in the morning, bright lights at dawn, silence that lasted so long, I'd start to wonder if I'd gone deaf. Tell us about your American contacts. Tell us about the money. Tell us about the network. There was no network. There were no Americans. There was no money. There was just me and 7 women who wanted to read about hope in a language that made it sound possible. But they didn't believe in simple things. They needed conspiracies. They needed enemies. They needed someone to blame for the restlessness they saw in women's eyes, for the questions that wouldn't stay buried, for the hunger that couldn't be fed with propaganda. On the 4th day in that place, one of the guards brought me tea. His hands were shaking, and the cup was too full, liquid sloshing dangerously close to the rim. When he set it down on the small table beside my cot, it tipped over, and the scalding liquid splashed across my face and chest like liquid fire. The pain was immediate and absolute. like lightning that decided to live under my skin, like acid eating through every nerve ending at once. I screamed, but the sound that came out was something primal and broken, not quite human anymore. "Forgive me," he said, but his eyes were cold and satisfied. How clumsy of me. They brought a doctor who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world. He dabbed some cream on the worst parts with hands that shook either from age or fear, and wrapped my face in gauze that smelled like antiseptic and pity. "You'll heal," he said without looking at me directly. "Eventually, the scars will fade, mostly." That night, lying on the concrete floor with my face on fire and my faith in ashes, I tried to pray, but the words wouldn't come. They'd been burned away along with my skin. I tried to remember Psalm 23, the one that had carried me through every crisis of my life. But all I could think about was the valley of the shadow of death, and how I was walking through it completely alone. "Where are you?" I whispered to the ceiling that wept moisture like tears. "Where are you? I gave up everything. I lost everything. I trusted you with everything. Where are you?" The ceiling didn't answer. God didn't answer. The universe held its breath and said nothing. Days blurred together like watercolors in the rain. I stopped counting the meals. I stopped counting the questions. I stopped counting the hours between sleep, because sleep had become another form of torture. In the darkness, my mind began to play tricks on me. I'd see my grandmother in the corner, shaking her head in disappointment, her face full of sorrow, for the granddaughter who'd thrown away everything she'd taught her. I'd hear my mother calling my name from somewhere far away, her voice getting weaker and more desperate each time. I'd smell the tea she was making that Tuesday evening when they took me away, and I'd wonder if she was still waiting for me to come back for dinner. And I began to wonder if I'd made it all up. The warmth I felt when I prayed, the sense of presence during our evening classes, the certainty that God was leading me to teach those women, to share His love in a language that made it sound like freedom. Maybe the imam with the kind eyes was right. Maybe I was just a confused woman who'd been poisoned by foreign ideas, who'd mistaken loneliness for calling, who'd confused desperation with divine purpose. Maybe there was no grand plan, no sacred mission. Maybe I was just a teacher who'd gotten in over her head, who'd led 7 women into danger for the sake of a God who might not even exist. One night, I found a torn page from Matthew's Gospel in my cell. Someone had left it there, tucked under my thin blanket. Or maybe it had blown in through the ventilation system from some other prisoner's secret cache. I held it up to the flickering light and read about Jesus walking on water, about Peter trying to follow and sinking when his faith wavered. But instead of comfort, I felt anger. Hot and sudden and clean, like fire in my chest. "Walking on water," I said to the empty room, my voice cracked and hoarse from disuse. "Where were you when I was drowning? Where were you when they burned my face? Where were you when Miriam gave up my name to save herself?" I tore the page in half, then in half again, then again and again, until the pieces were too small to tear anymore. They fell like snow around my feet, covering the concrete floor with fragments of promises that felt as broken as I was. "I'm done," I whispered to the walls, to the ceiling, to the God who wasn't listening. "I'm done believing. I'm done hoping. I'm done pretending that faith means anything in a world where good people suffer and bad people win. The silence that followed felt final, like a door closing, like a light going out, like the last breath of something that had been dying for weeks. And for the first time since they'd brought me to this place, I slept deeply. The sleep of the surrendered. The sleep of those who've finally stopped fighting the current and decided to drown. The courtroom was like a theater built for tragedies. High ceiling that made everyone look small. Wooden benches worn smooth by decades of desperate people waiting for verdicts that would change their lives forever. And a judge who looked at me like I was already guilty of everything I hadn't done yet. Like my presence in his courtroom was a personal insult. They'd given me clean clothes for the occasion, a gray dress that hung loose on my shrinking frame, and a headscarf that kept slipping down because my hair had grown long and wild during my months of captivity. My face was still bandaged on one side, the gauze yellowed at the edges and beginning to smell. The prosecutor spoke for an hour about spiritual terrorism, about corrupting the minds of innocent women, about serving foreign powers and undermining social stability. He used words like dangerous and subversive and enemy of the state, and each word felt like a stone thrown at my chest. I sat in my chair and watched him perform, because that's what it was. A performance. The verdict had been decided before I ever walked into that room, maybe before I'd ever been arrested. This was just theater, a show for the cameras and the newspapers and the people who needed to see that justice was being served. My mother didn't come. I understood. The shame of having a daughter like me, a daughter who'd chosen foreign gods over family honor, was too much to bear in public. My sister did come, sitting in the back row with her head down, pretending she didn't know me, counting the minutes until she could leave and forget this ever happened. Sarah Hosseini, the judge said finally, his voice echoing in the cavernous room. You have been found guilty of conducting illegal religious activities and corrupting public morals. You are sentenced to 2 years of corrective labor and psychological supervision. But the real sentence was unspoken, written in the eyes of everyone who looked at me. I was no longer Sarah the teacher. I was Sarah the traitor, Sarah the dangerous one. Sarah, the woman who'd betrayed her own people for a foreign god, who'd abandoned her when she needed him most. They released me on a Thursday morning in November, when the air was sharp with the promise of winter, and the mountains were already dusted with snow. 2 years had passed, but the world looked exactly the same. The same streets, the same buildings, the same tired faces hurrying past without making eye contact. But I was different, thinner, quieter, marked in ways that went deeper than the scar on my face. My mother had moved to my aunt's house across town. Too much shame, the neighbors explained when I knocked on our old door, their voices carefully neutral, their eyes full of pity and disgust. Too much talk. Better for everyone if she started fresh somewhere else. The new tenants looked at me like I might contaminate their threshold just by standing there. They closed the door quickly, and I heard them turning multiple locks. I had nowhere to go and no money to get there. The prison had given me enough cash for bus fare and 1 meal, but nothing beyond that. I slept in the mosque courtyard for 3 nights, huddled under newspapers and scraps of cardboard, until the security guards started asking questions I couldn't answer. On the fourth night, Mrs. Gorbani found me. She was 78 years old, a retired nurse who'd known my grandmother, with hands that had delivered babies and closed the eyes of the dying. She had kind eyes and careful movements, and she didn't ask questions when she led me to her small house on the edge of town, where the streetlights didn't reach and neighbors minded their own business. "You can stay," she said simply, like she was discussing the weather. "God told me you would come." Her house smelled like cardamom and old books, and the lingering presence of prayers said in secret for decades. She gave me a small room with a window that faced the mountains, and she fed me soup until I stopped looking like something that had crawled out of a grave. At night, I'd hear her praying in the next room, soft, persistent prayers in a language I couldn't identify, though sometimes I'd catch words I recognized. Jesus, mercy, healing. Her voice was steady and sure, like she was talking to someone she'd known her whole life. She was a Christian, had been for 40 years, she told me later. Secret and careful and absolutely certain, carrying her faith like a hidden flame that no amount of wind could extinguish. "I knew your grandmother," she said one evening as we drank tea and watched the sun disappear behind the mountains. "She used to pray for you, every day until she died. She knew where you belonged, even when you didn't." "She was Muslim," I said, confused. Mrs. Gorbani smiled, and her whole face lit up like she knew a wonderful secret. "Hearts know more than heads, child. She knew where you belonged. But I didn't belong anywhere. I was empty, hollow, a cracked cup that couldn't hold water anymore, a broken window that couldn't keep out the cold. I don't believe," I told her one night, the words falling out of me like stones. "Not in anything, not anymore. It's all gone." She reached over and touched my hand, her skin paper thin but warm. "That's okay," she said. "He believes in you." That night, I had the dream that shattered everything I thought I knew about abandonment and brought me face to face with a love I'd never dared to believe was real. I was back in the cell, but everything was different. The walls were alive with fire that moved like liquid gold, flames that danced and reached and whispered secrets I couldn't quite understand. But this wasn't the fire of destruction I'd known in that basement room. This was the fire of creation, of purification, of something ancient and holy and utterly beyond my comprehension. The flames surrounded me, but they didn't burn. They caressed my skin like gentle hands, warm and welcoming and impossibly tender. Every color I'd ever seen lived in those flames, crimson and gold, silver and white, so pure it made my eyes water. They moved like living things, like they had purpose, like they'd been sent specifically to find me in this place where hope had gone to die. The concrete floor beneath me transformed into something soft and yielding, like grass in a meadow. I'd never seen, but somehow remembered. The bars dissolved into mist. The ceiling opened up to reveal stars that sang in harmonies I felt in my bones rather than heard with my ears. And then he was there, not appearing gradually, not materializing slowly like something uncertain of its welcome. He was simply there, as if he'd been there all along, and I'd only just learned how to see him, standing in the center of the flames like they were cool water on the hottest day of summer, wearing white that somehow stayed pristine despite the smoke and ash that should have stained everything. His face was exactly what I'd always imagined, and nothing like I'd expected. Kind beyond measure, but with eyes that held depths of sorrow I couldn't fathom. Beautiful, in a way that made earthly beauty seem like a poor sketch of the real thing. And tired, so incredibly tired, like he'd been carrying the weight of every broken heart, every unanswered prayer, every moment of human suffering since time began. I fell to my knees on that impossible grass floor, my whole body shaking with recognition and terror and relief so profound it felt like drowning in reverse. "I'm not worthy," I cried, and my voice echoed strangely in that place where eternity had broken through into time. "I doubted you. I cursed your name. I gave up everything you gave me to believe in." He knelt beside me, and when he moved, the flames moved with him, bowing like subjects before their king. His presence radiated peace so complete it made my years of anxiety seem like a fever dream. He reached out and touched my face where the scar lived, where the hot tea had burned away my skin and my faith in one terrible moment. His fingers were cool and gentle, carrying the weight of infinite tenderness. Where he touched me, the pain that had lived there for 2 years, not just the physical pain, but the emotional agony, the spiritual devastation, the bone-deep certainty that I'd been abandoned, simply evaporated like morning mist. "You are mine," he said, and his voice contained every beautiful sound that had ever existed. Ocean waves and baby laughter, wind through wheat fields, and mothers singing lullabies. "I never left you. Not for a moment, not for a breath, not for a heartbeat, not even when you stopped believing I was there." "But I couldn't feel you," I whispered, tears streaming down my face, tears that tasted like relief and healing and coming home. "I called your name and heard only silence. I reached for you and touched only emptiness." He smiled then, and it was like watching the sun rise for the first time. "I was in the fire that burned your face," he said, gesturing to the flames that surrounded us like a cathedral of light. "I was in the silence that taught you to listen deeper. I was in the emptiness that made room for more of me. I was in every question that kept you awake, in every doubt that refined your faith, in every tear that watered the ground where new hope would grow." He showed me scenes from my imprisonment, but now I could see them through different eyes. In the interrogation room, he was standing behind my chair, his hands on my shoulders, whispering strength into my spirit when my body wanted to collapse. In the basement cell, he was sitting beside me when I cried, collecting every tear like precious pearls. When the guard accidentally spilled that tea, he was there, catching my pain before it could destroy the part of me that still believed love was possible. "Why didn't you stop it?" I asked, the question that had tortured me for years finally finding voice. "Because fire refines," he said simply, taking my scarred hands in his perfect ones. "And you were never meant to stay silver. You were always meant to be gold. Pure gold that would shine in dark places, that would reflect my light to women who'd forgotten what light looked like." I woke up crying, but these were different tears than any I'd shed in that basement or in the months that followed. These were tears of recognition, of reunion, of understanding that the story I thought had ended in abandonment had actually been leading to this moment of impossible grace. My whole body shook with the force of it. Years of buried grief and abandoned faith pouring out of me like a dam bursting, making room for something new to rush in and fill all the empty spaces. When I touched my face in the pre-dawn darkness, the scar was still there, but it felt different, softer, like it was transforming from a mark of shame into a badge of honor, from evidence of suffering into proof of survival. Mrs. Gorbani found me in the kitchen at dawn, still crying, still shaking, still trying to understand what had happened to me in that place where dreams and reality meet. "He came," I whispered, and the words felt like the first true thing I'd said in years. She nodded like she'd been expecting this moment since the day she found me sleeping in the mosque courtyard. "He always does," she said, wrapping me in arms that felt like home. "He always comes back for his daughters. We just have to be broken enough to see him clearly." Sunday morning arrived wrapped in golden light that seemed to echo the fire from my dream. Mrs. Gorbani asked if I wanted to come with her to church, and for the first time in years, my heart said yes before my mind could construct all the reasons why it was dangerous, why it was foolish, why it might lead to more pain. "It's not really a church," she explained as we walked through streets that sparkled with morning dew. "Just a house where people gather to remember they're not alone." The building looked ordinary from the outside, whitewashed walls, blue shutters, a garden where roses grew wild and free. But when we stepped inside, I felt something shift in the air, like the very molecules were rearranged by the presence of faith gathered in one place. 20 people sat in a circle in what had once been a living room. Their faces were maps of different journeys, some young and bright with new hope, others weathered by years of secret believing. But all of them radiated something I'd almost forgotten existed, the peace of people who'd found their home in each other. I wore a scarf that covered most of my face, but the pastor saw me anyway. He was a man in his 50s with gentle eyes and hands that looked like they'd worked hard and prayed harder. When our eyes met across the circle, I saw no pity, no curiosity, just recognition. The look of someone who knew what it meant to pay prices for faith. The service was beautifully simple. No grand cathedral architecture, no stained glass windows casting rainbow shadows, no organ music echoing off vaulted ceilings. Just people sharing their hearts, their hopes, their struggles and victories in voices that shook with honesty. They sang songs I didn't know but somehow recognized, melodies that felt like coming home after the longest journey imaginable. Their voices rose in harmony that seemed to bridge earth and heaven, human and divine, broken and whole. I found myself humming along, my voice rusty from years of silence, but eager to join the chorus. A young woman shared about losing her job for refusing to work on Sundays. An elderly man spoke about his grandson's healing from an illness doctors couldn't explain. A mother wept as she described her daughter's return to faith after years of rebellion. Each story was a thread in a tapestry of grace I was only beginning to understand. Halfway through the service, the pastor stood up and looked around the room with eyes that saw souls instead of surfaces, hearts instead of facades. "If anyone here has suffered for his name," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd walked that road himself, "would you stand? Not to be seen or celebrated, but to be witnessed. To let us know we're not alone in what this faith sometimes costs." My legs moved before my mind could object, before fear could construct its usual barriers. I stood up slowly, my whole body trembling like a leaf in wind, and then others rose with me. One by one, they stood, bearers of invisible scars, carriers of hidden wounds, survivors of prices paid in darkness. An old man with missing fingers, lost for refusing to deny Christ during a workplace raid 20 years ago. A woman whose eyes held shadows from psychiatric treatments designed to cure her Christianity. A teenager with burn marks on his arms that looked sickeningly familiar, consequences of a father's rage at his son's conversion. We were the wounded ones, the marked ones, the ones who'd learned that following Jesus sometimes means walking through valleys where death casts long shadows. But we were also the chosen ones, the refined ones, the ones who'd discovered that his presence doesn't always feel comfortable, but it's always real. I didn't speak that morning. I couldn't. The words were still forming somewhere deep inside me, still learning how to carry truth instead of bitterness, hope instead of despair. But I didn't need to speak. My presence was my testimony. My scars spoke louder than words. After the service, people came to me with the reverence of those who recognize sacred ground. They didn't ask intrusive questions or demand details of my suffering. They simply touched my hand gently, whispering, "We know. We've been there too. You're not alone anymore." An elderly woman with silver hair and eyes that held ancient wisdom pressed a small wooden cross into my palm. It was worn smooth by decades of faithful fingers, dark with the oil of countless prayers. "This was my mother's," she said, her voice thick with emotion. She carried it through 40 years of hiding, through persecution that would have broken weaker souls. Now it's yours. Pass it on when the time comes. A middle-aged man with calloused hands and laugh lines around his eyes stepped forward with his wife, both of them radiating the kind of settled peace that comes from weathering storms together. "We have a spare room," he said simply. "If you ever need a place to stay, to heal, to just be safe for a while. No questions asked, no rent required. Just family taking care of family." For the first time in 3 years, I understood that I wasn't alone. For the first time since that Tuesday evening, when they'd knocked on my door and changed everything, I was part of something bigger than my pain, stronger than my fear, more enduring than any system that had tried to destroy me. I was part of the family of the scarred and the saved, the broken and the beautiful, the ones who'd walked through fire and emerged not unburned, but refined. We were living proof that God's love doesn't protect us from suffering. It transforms suffering into something sacred. Standing in that circle of survivors, I felt my heart beat with a rhythm I'd forgotten, the steady pulse of belonging, of purpose, of hope reborn from ashes. The woman who'd entered that room was not the same woman who would leave it. Something fundamental had shifted, not just in my circumstances, but in my soul. I was no longer Sarah the victim, Sarah the broken one, Sarah the woman who'd lost everything. I was Sarah the witness, Sarah the refined one, Sarah the woman who'd met Jesus in the fire and lived to tell about it. Cypress smells of sun-warmed salt and crushed oregano. Most mornings I wake before the call of the gulls, slide the balcony door open, and let the breeze carry in sounds that are not sirens or iron doors clanging shut. I make thick coffee in a battered copper pot a neighbor gave me, hold the cup to my lips, and wait for the sting that used to follow every quiet moment. It still comes, but softer now, like the echo of a bell that's almost out of hearing. The papers in my wallet insist I am Maria Constantinou, resident translator, harmless. The scar on my cheek keeps disagreeing, tugging when I smile, reminding me that memory lives in skin long after governments stamp new names on it. I touch it sometimes, the way you check a tooth that used to hurt, half expecting pain, half relieved when it isn't there. My apartment is small, one room for sleeping, one for everything else, but every inch has a story. The bookshelf is a mosaic of languages, Greek grammar guides, a Dari New Testament printed on cheap paper, handwritten Farsi devotionals copied by candlelight. On the desk, wrapped in linen, lies the Bible that crossed borders with me, pages torn, margins scorched. I keep it closed most days. Opening it releases a faint smell of smoke that still makes my throat tighten. But at night I trace the burnt edges with my fingertip and remember how he met me in flames hotter than any furnace could ever manage. Work begins after sunset. The women arrive in 2s and 3s, carrying plastic bags that rustle like restless birds. We push the table against the wall, sit cross-legged on the floor, and learn verbs that feel like tools. To choose, to trust, to stay. I never mention theology. I read a sentence. Perfect love drives out fear. They translate it themselves, tasting every syllable, deciding whether the words will live in their mouths tomorrow. Most nights they stay late, telling stories that hang in the room long after the door closes behind them. Sons still lost at sea, husbands somewhere behind barbed wire, mothers who pray 5 times a day for news that never comes. I listen, because listening is the cheapest medicine I know. One Wednesday, while the kettle hissed, my phone chimed with a message request. A number I didn't recognize, a country code that made my heart stumble. The text was short. "It's me. Can we talk?" But the name below it was longer than the screen. Miriam. I stared until the kettle ran dry. When I finally called, her face appeared, thinner, older, but unmistakably hers. She said my name, my real one, and burst into tears. For 10 minutes, neither of us spoke. We just watched each other breathe, proof we were both still here. She lives near the border now, married, a mother. She teaches girls to read using pages she copied from my old lessons. Fear still visits, she said, but not every night. She wanted forgiveness I had already given 1,000 silent times. Instead of saying so, I told her about the dream, about the man in white who stepped out of fire and put his cool hand on my scar. She covered her mouth and whispered that lately, when she prays, she feels heat on her palms, gentle, like someone warming them by a hearth. We laughed, actually laughed, at how stubborn love can be. After the call, I sat on the tiles until dawn, knees aching, heart strangely quiet. I realized the miracle wasn't that Miriam had found me. The miracle was that when she asked, I had no anger left to offer her. I still wake some nights convinced I smell wet concrete. On those nights I light a single beeswax candle and let the flame steady my pulse. I remember the cell, the orange glow beyond the bars, the moment I thought silence meant abandonment. Then I remember the voice inside the fire, saying I was never alone, not even for a heartbeat, and my lungs start working again. If you are listening because you can't sleep, because the world has pressed its thumb against your throat, let me tell you what the candle tells me. The dark is heavy, but it is not endless. It bends, always, toward the smallest flame. I won't promise easy days or tidy endings. My own life is still rough around every edge. But I can promise presence, the same quiet presence that sat beside me on a filthy floor in a country that denies I exist, now hums in the silence between your breaths. You don't have to feel him for him to be there. You only have to stay alive long enough for morning. So breathe. Touch your own scar, visible or not, and remember that tissue grows stronger where it once tore. Sit through one more night. When dawn slips under your door, make coffee or tea or nothing at all, and thank Jesus, the light who keeps finding you. He always does. He always will.